We're in Ash.
We're recording. Oh, brilliant stuff.
So this is the first kind of like a pilot of a podcast that we're also putting out as a video podcast, I suppose. Let me do a quick. This is the Aah and Col podcast. What were they thinking? Which is, I know what most people said when we said we were going to do a podcast. So the concept here is we're going to look at various things. It's going to be films. It's going to be text. And we're going to
Poems.
It could be music. I might introduce Ash to some decent music, not just the Cheeky Girls.
Nothing wrong with the Cheeky Girls. Lembit Opic. Is that his name? Lembit, Lambert and Butler. Who is he? He was dating one of the Cheeky Girls.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't read Hello.
No, not Lemmy.
Limpet.
Limpet. He was dating one of the Cheeky Girls, and since they're identical twins, I think that counts as both of them. He was an MP, but not a proper one. I think Lib Dems or something like that.
I have no idea. I need to refer to. I just don't want to type the word Cheeky Girls into my search engine. I'm a horror writer. My search history is supposed to get me arrested.
Yep. This.
Hold on. Lempit.
What?
Lempit. Opic.
Lempit.
Lembit.
Lembit Opic. Yeah.
Lembit
Opic.
Lembit Opic. He's just making it up now.
Yeah.
Isn't that just that a character of a series of unfortunate events?
Yeah, Lembit Opic Snicket. And these Cheeky Girls. Wow. Way to fuck up an introduction, actually.
Off to a fantastic start there.
Yeah,
that was cool. Anyway, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about things creatively, but we're not actually going to go and do research. Heaven forbid. No, we're going to talk about the creative process as if we were doing it. So when we look at today's piece, which is going to be Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, we're not going to look into what our other academics have said. These are the probable influences of Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to look at this from our point of view as creative writers and say, if we were writing this is how we would get from A to B, or how we would have got from A to B, and try and unpick the thought process so we can get down to the little details where the thought was so genius. That's what actually makes it a lasting piece, I think, is what we'll be able to pull out of this. Because there'll be that point where, because I've always hated the phrase, when people sit there and go, you couldn't make it up, could you? Well, I think you could, to be perfectly honest with you. As a creative writer, I could write it, yes. But there are certain moments where you go, God, I wish I'd written that. And that's what I hope we find in this little, when we go mining into these things, I hope that's what we'll find.
Yeah, absolutely. And usually you find the people saying you couldn't make it up are people writing for the Daily Mail when they do nothing but make it up, really.
You couldn't make it up as fascistly as we do.
Fall of the House of Usher, Edgar Allan Poe. It's a story, as most people are aware. Spoiler alert for anybody who's unfamiliar.
And to be perfectly honest with you, you've had over 100 years, so.
Yes, it's a story. Bear with me. I've got some notes here that just remind me what the story's about. All right, I'll accept your license then.
Every so often, you've got to have legitimate software, Ash. Just occasionally.
Says who? Nobody's mentioned that on Pirate Bay yet. So, Fall of the House of Usher. Synopsis. An unnamed narrator arrives at the House of Usher, a very creepy mansion owned by his boyhood friend, Roderick Usher. Roderick has been sick, afflicted by a disease of the mind, wrote to his friend, the narrator, asking for help. The narrator spends some time admiring the awesomely spooky Usher edifice. That is the house, that's nothing kinky. Whilst doing so, he explains that Roderick and his sister are the last of the Usher bloodline, and that the family is famous for its dedication to the arts. Eventually, the narrator heads inside to see his friend. Yes, I would love. Thank you. Roderick appears to be a sick man. He suffers from an acuteness of the senses, as we all do. Hypersensitivity to light, sound, taste, and tactile sensations. And he feels that he will die of the fear he feels. He attributes part of his illness to the fact that his sister, Madeline, suffers from catalepsy and will soon die. He hasn't left the mansion in years, and the narrator tries to help him get his mind off death and gloom by poring over the literature that Roderick so loves, but it doesn't seem to help. As Roderick predicted, Madeline soon dies, or at least we think she does. All we know is that Roderick tells the narrator she's dead. Hopefully he breaks it a little bit more subtly than that. And that she appears to be dead when he looks at her. Of course, because of her catalepsy, she might just look like she's dead post-seizure. At Roderick's request, the narrator helps him to entomb her body in one of the vaults underneath the mansion. While they do so, the narrator discovers that the two of them were twins and that they shared some sort of supernatural, probably extrasensory bond. About a week later, on a dark and stormy night, the narrator and Usher find themselves unable to sleep. They decide to pass away the scary night by reading a book. As the narrator reads the text aloud, all the sounds from the fictional story can be heard resounding from below the mansion. It doesn't take long for Usher to freak out. He jumps up and declares that they buried Madeline alive and that now she's coming back. And sure enough, the doors blow open and there stands a trembling, bloody Madeline. She throws herself at Usher, who falls to the floor and after violent agony dies along with his sister. The narrator flees outside. He watches the House of Usher crack in two and sink into the dark, dank pool that lies before it. I'm tempted to say duh, 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 but I won't.
That was very good.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
roughly what you took away from it, Col?
To start with, the craziness of the entire story itself, because when you read it, when you put it as a synopsis like that, it seems to have a very straightforward narrative. You know, it's the classics of like brother meets sister, sister's completely barking, friend turns up to kind of help with the barking sister, finds out that the brother's mad as well, buries the sister alive because she probably wasn't dead, she's just had a fit, as actually wasn't uncommon back then, to be perfectly honest with you. And then when she comes back, the force and power, the supernatural power between the brother and sister caused the house to break, which actually is also a sort of literal broken home at the end of it, as the fall of the House of Usher, which also works as a pun against them being the last of the particular bloodline as well. So I kind of got all that. But when you read the actual text and the way that he writes it, it suddenly becomes immensely dreamy and sinister and melancholic. So the whole thing kind of takes you on the ride and almost puts you in the mindset of being in that crazy situation. And it does become really kind of imposing. I listened to a version of it read by Christopher Lee, which I think added that extra element. You know, it was definitely more scary than anything I'd ever seen on Jackanory, put it that way. And I think it encapsulates the idea of, is it real or not by the end of it? Who's actually mad? Is it actually the narrator himself who's just insane and has almost dreamt all of this, which I know Poe is particularly good at?
I think the narrator must be a little bit off his tits on some level, because he's gone to spend some time with with a bloke called Roderick, which... if I had a boyhood friend called Roderick and he invited me to stay, in that case it would be, sorry mate, your name's Roderick. Yeah, it's not happening.
Wouldn't you? You wouldn't actually call him Roderick all the time.
I don't think I could, as a heterosexual man, I couldn't stare at another man and call him Roddy or Rod. That would just be, it would feel strange. It would feel as though I was exploring things that should remain unexplored for somebody of my age.
I don't know.
Yeah, good point. Yeah,
but that's it. So it's in the writing itself, not just the story idea. Because I think as a basic story idea, I think it has, a very kind of its time structure to it that you can see. It's removed family. When he's talking about gentry, because of the house itself, the way it describes it, he starts off by going up this dreary road, you know, and the house is miles away from anywhere. And there was a lot of kind of eccentric characters that used to live up in the countryside, in particular with money, sort of going back at the time when he wrote it. So from a creative point of view, at the time it was written, it wouldn't have actually been so otherworldly to have such a mansion and have you know, people living in them that nobody really knew anything about, because they wouldn't have been going to the village themselves and stuff like that.
I think you make a really valid point as well about how the structure sets off with a feel of melancholia and how it is very much of its time. Am I right to just read a little bit out from the opening?
Yeah, go for it.
Where we've got, during the whole of a dull, dark and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. Right, that's your opening sentence, and it's so bleak and dismal. I mean, if it wasn't Poe, I would have tossed this aside and thought, yeah, that's fucking grim, and not bothered.
I mean, you used a word there, actually. If you did a forensic analysis of this, the forensic analysis where you do the word count, I actually think within Poe, dreary would be one of his favourite words, actually.
And gloom.
He uses gloom a lot, but dreary just because he uses it in The Raven a lot as well, doesn't he? So.
Yes, but then again, it rhymes with so many things, doesn't it?
Yeah, I suppose.
Dreary, weary. That Raven's a little bit leery. Yeah.
Raveny. You know, gone through many edits. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So when you do the opening thing, even describing the house itself as melancholic is quite an interesting thing to do, because he's using an emotion to describe something that is essentially just inanimate. And he's not using colours, he's not using size or any of the other kind of classic tropes or schemas that you would use in those particular points. He's using a straight emotion that is, I mean, melancholy. It's not even the most depressing, is it? It's that kind of slightly grey feeling that you get when you go out on a drizzly morning and you just go, oh, you know, your shoulders slump. So it gives you a feeling that you set yourself in a position to, and it kind of makes the whole house itself kind of slump and look a little bit pissed off.
You think he's doing that so that he's got a starting point with, look, we're a bit melancholy at the start. By the time we get to the end of it, it's going to be a grand guignol of despair and gloom, and yeah,
I think it is very much setting the scene, isn't it? And it's a short story, so he has to get into it very, very quickly, and by doing that, he's really going for, in the mind of the reader, to put the reader in a kind of depressed state to start reading this, because I think that kind of to make the mind wander, maybe, because I sometimes think, you know, when you get moments on your own, they always say the worst place to be is caught as a prisoner in your own head, because you can kind of overthink things. And that whole it's not even the first paragraph, it's like the first third of the paragraph. It really sets the reader in their own head. It kind of says there's, you know, it's almost saying it's like a prison, but without it being security orientated prison. It's putting it in that bleak mood, which is like you say, setting the scene for the whole thing. But it's almost like you're about to step into madness. You're about to go into depression here, and we're going to take you on that journey.
Yeah, I think madness is one of the things that we'll see cropping up repeatedly whenever we look at Poe as well.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. Is that because we think that Poe might have been a little bit on the mad side? For want of a better, I appreciate mad is sort of like a horribly brusque term that brushes over a lot of mental.
He definitely had depression from reading his stuff. I would say he was definitely along those lines, that he was someone you couldn't cheer up in that respect. You know, there was, and you see that if these are kind of like spilling out of his thoughts on the page and how he sees things, then yeah, I think he's definitely on that very much a depressive. I wouldn't know about manic, because I don't think I've read anything that goes mania, but he definitely understands the other side of thought.
Do we think that writers are like that, though? Do we think that what we write is an overspill of who we are? Do we think that, for example, E.L. James is really... I don't even know where I'm going with that thought.
I don't think E.L. James is a complete spill out on the page of her thoughts. I think it's mainly just where she's flicking on.
Or any other effluvia.
Eh?
Or any other effluvia. But
pages of Twilight, I think that's all it does.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that I don't know whether it worries me in a defensive way that at the moment I'm writing horror. Does that mean that I've got something within me that keeps me drawn to the macabre? Am I depressed and wanting to explore these themes? Yeah.
I think sometimes with the creative thoughts, sometimes it can be cathartic, where you've got something playing on your mind and you want to get it out, usually my boss, usually dying in horrible ways. But the main part of it sometimes is about choices that you make, isn't it? Sometimes it's like when you're writing poetry, you sit down and that's where you're going to spill out your emotions on the page. Sometimes when you're kind of doing it, unless you have a specific theme you're writing about. And I think this is where the Fall of the House of Usher plays in between. Does it look like a planned piece? Is this someone who sat down one day and said, "Oh, I've got this idea of a house that his brother and sister live in, and they're all a bit crazy and dusty wedding dresses and that kind of thing"? Or did he just start writing? Or was this genuinely a spill of he just had this feeling to write something and start writing out? Because I know I've recently been to Whitby and I can see the Bram Stoker influence, and we will do Bram Stoker at another time. But you see all around, as you get there and you look at the architecture and you look at the structure of the place, you can understand how he sat down and started working out how to place this together and how to bring the players in and out. But with Poe, I don't get that sense of it at all. I get the sense that he starts at the first sentence and writes all the way to the end, and then maybe gets edited back, where he gets an editor. So you haven't used dreary enough, put more dreary in it, please, or something like that. But it does seem to be more of a flow of consciousness with Poe's work, and I found that in particular with Fall of the House of Usher, in that the ideas seem to kind of jump on the back of each other rather than follow a path that lands on them, if you know what I mean. So if you plan your punchlines, you kind of then get this path that lands on the punchline at a good timing. But these ones kind of flow into them, and when she bursts through the door, there's no real setup for it in that respect. They start hearing noises. It's almost like they're hearing noises. What are these noises? I know. And it just happens at that point rather than being the initial idea when he started.
What were you saying before then about how you'd gone into Poe and didn't like him, but it was your fault?
Yeah, for years I didn't like Poe. For years I kept trying to read it, but of course the melancholy and dreariness kind of kept putting me off. But part of that was going way back in time when I had an Amstrad CPC 464 back in the 80s, old computer, colour monitor, and there was a computer game called The Fall of the House of Usher. And I remembered the computer game, so I thought I'll go and look up the computer game because we were doing this, right? And so I looked it up, I found it on YouTube, and it just reminded me of how utterly shit it was, because it was a terrible game, and it had nothing to do with Poe. Honestly, they just used the name and had a kind of spooky image at the beginning and a house, but it was the most awful game. And I thought I liked Poe because I liked the Vincent Price movies. I thought they were brilliant, right? But when you try to read Poe, especially when you're younger, they say it has that depressive mount. But when you have a game that was just so awful by the title, because I loved the films, Fall of the House of Usher, right? And then you get this game and it's dreadful, honestly. It was just the worst game ever. And I think I kind of associated how bad that was with Poe. So every time I started reading Poe, all I thought about was this game, to such a point where I forgot about the game and never really gave Poe a chance. So this is kind of, this whole experiment of doing this has rekindled my appreciation of Poe, definitely.
Oh, brilliant. Does that mean you're going to be dipping into more Poe then?
I'm going to definitely dip into more Poe, yeah, because I do like as you know, I'm completely crazy about creativity, and I liked the way it flowed in that way. Like I say, if I was writing this kind of thing, that's exactly how I would have written this story. It would have been, I start at the beginning. I would have just had this idea that I wanted to have something that was down and dreary and black, and as my mood is, and then as I was writing it, finding these other little bits that you could go into that were kind of a little bit creepy but didn't necessarily make any sense to it, until you kind of get to the end where you just, I mean, I love the boldness of just walking away from it and watching the house break. It's like, I mean, that was nicked in Poltergeist, wasn't it? When you walk out and the whole house was just taken in. So,
and I think it was nicked also at the end of Blues Brothers, where they step out of the police car and it just falls into itself. Yeah.
Yeah. So that I thought was, you go back and look at those, but you can see that that was not the original idea, was to have a house go in. It was almost, it might have been inspired by scenes. I'm quite inspired by architecture, where you see buildings and you go, yeah, that would make a great scene, and you start trying to piece together bits around it to whether or not you can create the story. But I think Poe was just more flowy than that. I think, like I say, it has so much more of a as it goes kind of feel to it, without any real roadmap, so to speak.
And yeah, I get what you're saying about architecture as well. There's a house near us that I suppose it has been abandoned, but it's been taken over by pigeons. There's like a couple of holes there just above the bay. There's as you walk past it, you can see pigeons in some of the rooms in the house, looking out at you, which is an unreal thing. And I know it's going to end up in a story somewhere not too far in the future for me. It's just one of those things, the House of Pigeons. It's...
We went up Rivington Pike, and on Rivington Pike there's a thing called Pigeon Tower.
They know how to name their buildings around there, don't they?
Yes, I mean, there's no pigeons in it. It might have been at some point. It's called Pigeon Tower. So having a pigeon house, that makes sense.
And part of me is thinking, what the hell must it? I mean, it must stink of pigeon shit in there, and it must be potentially a health hazard. But also, that just makes it all the more exciting.
It's also very Hitchcockian, isn't it? I mean, you can imagine the idea of those pigeons actually luring people in. Just going off and stealing their handbags or whatever. I don't know what pigeons do. But luring people in and killing them, actually being killed by pigeons. So you go in, there's like a pile of bones in there where these pigeons have been having their, their not cannibalistic, it wouldn't be that, carnivorous pigeons,
Yeah, or maybe if I can sort of like shift them from pigeons to seagulls, because I've got a thing about seagulls at the moment, I could steal their chips.
That'd be great.
So where do you think you got the idea from?
Where did he get the idea from? I don't know. I don't know. For me, I think reading it, I think he saw an old abandoned mansion house that no longer had an owner because all the family was gone. I think that's where it started from. I think he might have been out either on a ride or walking through the countryside and found one of these houses. And they do get into a dilapidated state so quickly. They get into a dilapidated state when they're living in them, because they're so big. But, when something falls into disrepair, then I can imagine you kind of seeing that. And it's more to do with that description right at the beginning, the melancholic house, that you can almost say that he looked at this house and it gave that back to him, that this house was depressed, that no one was living in it. And I can imagine standing looking at the building and feeling those feelings inside yourself reflected on the house itself. So I think that's where I think it started very much where that first paragraph is.
One of the things I've been reading, it's like suggests that Poe's inspiration for the story might be based upon events of the Hezekiah Usher house, which I think the clue's in the name there that, yeah, it possibly was. It was located on the Usher estate that's now a 3-block area in downtown modern Boston, Massachusetts, adjacent to Boston Common, bound by Tremont Street to the northwest, Washington Street to the southeast. House was constructed in 1684, and it was either torn down or relocated in 1830, which was 9 years before this story was actually produced. And other sources indicate that a sailor and the young wife of the older owner were caught and entombed in their trysting spot by her husband. And when the Usher house was torn down in 1830, 2 bodies were found embraced in a cavity in the cellar.
2 bodies embraced in a cavity in the cellar. Yeah, I
love the fact that you picked up on that. Yeah, he'd been inspired by some big creepy old house, and this looks like it was inspired by a creepy old house. There are a couple of other bits that I'm going to get onto in a minute, but and I do think there is that awful lot of inspiration, and I don't know why. No, I do know why. It's because you don't know what you're going to encounter in each of the rooms. We just tried watching something on... what the hell was that channel we just tried watching? That crap One thing.
Play.
Was it called One Channel or something? Or Channel 1 or Channel 0?
What, that programme?
Yeah.
Channel 0.
Channel 0. We were just trying to look at something on Channel 0, and the second season... Sorry, it was a program called Channel 0. The second season, it looks like it's got people trying to go through different rooms in a house. See, that scared the dog, that whole notion.
That dog's definitely seen something on the stairs, isn't it? That's not that.
That's, Hound of the Baskervilles is there now. Very small Hound of the Baskervilles.
Chihuahua of the Baskervilles.
Oswald, shut the hell up.
Oh, shush, darling.
You've got people who are meant to go through 6 rooms, one room after another, with a big spooky main boss at the end of these rooms that's going to be the big scare that nobody ever comes back from. And I think that's what we see when we see these big buildings. We see the potential for what's going to be in each room. Is it going to be that, this one's bad, but next one's a little bit worse and a little bit worse, and Christ, there's hundreds of these damned rooms, and by the time you get to the end one, you will have encountered the worst things ever.
There's a story in the Blood Ink book that I wrote, the first one, and that's actually based on something that me and a friend did when we were kids. I grew up on a council estate in Hollingbury, which is just north of Brighton on the South Downs, and we moved in 1976, and very shortly after we moved in, there were 2 children's homes at the end of the close, and one of them got closed down. And you never knew why, but for years it was sat there, and there was a caretaker on the estate that none of us ever saw. But we used to find if you broke the windows in this children's home, the next day it'd be repaired. And you'd never see anyone repair it. And then one day I actually worked out that they repaired it with putty, and the putty was still wet. So we were playing in the garden of this place because you could mess about and nobody could see it. And I took this little window pane out, which I described very much in the book. And I opened the window, got in, and broke into this empty house. And this is still to this day one of the most frightening things I've ever done, because we walked around this old children's home, and you found things like there were bolts on the outside of the bedroom doors, and there were these kind of really strange metal hoops on the floors, and all you could think were the most sinister acts had gone on in there, and your imagination just went completely crazy as you're walking through the place. And it has inspired a couple of pieces. There's a poem I wrote as well regarding it, because it's just such striking images, and it was a very mood. And after that, the whole house did actually take on a whole sinister feel to it. I looked at it; it was an evil house. Even now, there's people live in that house. I'm not going to mention the address of it in that respect, because I don't think that would be fair. But I look at that house now, and I go down to Brighton, and I go past where I grew up, and it still has that almost exorcist feel to it. It was just such a creepy place that's why I think he was inspired by a house in particular, because they do have this really they are. We anthropomorphize them so much in that it's almost like the house itself has feelings.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Amityville house. It's almost like a face, isn't it, with those like little triangular eyes and that dome-shaped part of the head. Yeah, yeah, it's impossible not to look at a house as not being sort of like two windows for eyes and a nose for a door. Yeah,
and there's one, isn't there, that I can't remember where it is, called the Hitler house, where they've actually built the roof in such a way that it looks like his quiff. And there's an arch above the door that at certain times of the day it casts a shadow like a Hitler mustache over the door. You can look that one up. Look up Hitler House. And
yes, I will be doing that as soon as we've finished. Yeah, yeah, because I don't mind having things like that in my search history. Cheeky Girls, Hitler House. Yeah, I'm cool with all of those things. Another source then, potentially for the inspiration, it might be from an actual couple, Mr. and Mrs. Luke Usher. They were friends and acting colleagues of his mother, Eliza Poe, because his mother, Eliza, was an actor. Well, technically she was an actress, but I appreciate that it's sort of like politically correct to refer to actors and actresses as actors, because that way we're not being gender specific. And yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Usher took care of Eliza's 3 children, including Poe, during her time of illness and eventual death, which, again, and I think it adds to Poe's sense of melancholia that his parents died whilst he was very young, and people took the other children. His brother and sister were taken by somebody else, and they didn't want Poe. Well, they didn't want Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, obviously, they were quite happy with 2 Poes, but the third Poe, who was Edgar Allan, ended up with, Edgar Poe, ended up with the Allan family, who were... Mr. Allan wasn't as nice to Poe as somebody could be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, that builds upon the idea that most of his writing was coming from a sense of his mental state as well as his creativity, that his emotional mental state and his creativity were definitely blurring lines between them at that point.
And I've got notes here that say that the German writer E.T. Hoffmann was a role model and inspiration for Poe, and published the story Das Majorette in 1819. And there are many similarities between the 2 stories, including the physical breaking of a house, eerie sounds in the night, story within a story, and the house owner being called Roderick, spelled German. And because Poe was familiar with Hoffmann's work, he knew the story. But I'm not sure whether I can actually buy into that. I mean, if I was about to write a story about a serial killer who worked with the police, there's no way I'm going to call him Dexter. Yeah, and this whole notion that Poe has pretty much cut and pasted this entire story from Hoffmann, translating it maybe from German before we'd got things like ways of identifying plagiarism so blatantly. But yeah, and I don't know, do you think Roderick was a sexier name back then?
I don't know. I mean, Roderick is one of those, I was trying to think, because when you said Roderick, I'm pretty certain going back even to the sort of 50s and 60s, Roderick was a name that was actually used. And there's a number of actors, I'm pretty certain from that time, that called themselves Roderick.
Well, in They Live, you've got Rowdy Roddy Piper, haven't you? Which I'm assuming that's short for Roderick. Was Rod Stewart a Roderick?
It could be Rodney. Rodney kind of fell out of fashion because of Only Fools and Horses, didn't it?
Yes.
But Roderick...
Yeah, Rowdy Roderick Piper. Yeah.
I mean, you can have things like that. You could say that he's done his own version of it, because artists do that all the time. I remember reading a story about Salvador Dali, and there's a painting called The Little Boy Blue, and it's this famous painting. I think it's a Rembrandt, and Dali wanted to paint his own version of it. So the New York Museum, where it was, gave him 3 hours with this painting on his own. And when he came out, he'd actually drawn like a rhinoceros horn, and he said, "That's my version of The Little Boy Blue." So it wasn't uncommon for artists to do that, especially when you've got, if you think that your main audience isn't going to know what the source is. Is it a copy and paste? I don't know. I don't think it is. I think sometimes you can have a heavy influence and not realize where that influence has come from. Sometimes it's not necessarily plagiarism. You might look at a house and go, oh my God, that's amazing. And then you start going into the story and there are very big similarities with those sort of things. That can happen quite often. But I don't know. Reading his other stuff, he doesn't seem, people say that J.K. Rowling did pretty much the same thing, and you can find evidence of it. But J.K. Rowling's body of work stands on its own, greatly, even though there are similarities to things where she's obviously been influenced by things, maybe. But I don't think absolute plagiarism.
No, I think, I fully agree with you on that. We've got notes here that say another German author, Heinrich Kloren's 1812 story, The Robber's Castle, as translated into English by John Hardman, published in 1828, The Robber's Tower, may have served as an inspiration, according to Schmidt and Hansen, because as well as sharing common elements, such as a young woman with a fear of premature burial, being interred in a sepulchre directly beneath the protagonist's chamber, stringed instruments and the living twin of the buried girl, they identify textual evidence of Poe's use of the story and concludes that the inclusion of Vigile Mortorium, the opening part, Vigils for the Dead, according to the use of the Church of Mainz, is drawn from the use of a similarly obscure book. I think, I can see you scowling there, and I'm in complete agreement with you. This is just people saying, there was a story like that before. No. And
I've entered the world of academia, even though I've constantly had, and it's probably recorded on record somewhere, my disdain for some things academic. And sometimes I see things like that as just being academics trying to find a purpose for their title as being an academic. They have gone into something in such detail, they have to find something about it, to go that way. The concept of twins being somehow psychically linked, I think, has been there all the way through. Are we going to say that that is also what Stephen King was doing in The Shining by using dead twins? It is that kind of, oh God, what's it called now? I remember Douglas Adams said it about the number 42. And people kept going on about, if you do this and it's 42, and if you look at the Hubble telescope, the angle of it is like 41.999996, which is almost 42, and therefore he was saying this. Douglas Adams was saying, effectively, you have an idea. And if that idea is popular, it will eventually become prosaic. It will become its own prophecy, and it will be seen everywhere. It's like Catch-22 is a classic example of that, because Catch-22 doesn't actually exist. When the book was written, there is no clause in any armed forces that say if you can say you're insane, you're not, because you can self-diagnose. It doesn't exist. He just thought it was a great idea. And he needed a number. And he sat down with his friends one night and said, I need a funny number. And they all threw numbers at each other and they all wet themselves laughing at 22. So he called it Catch-22. Now it's a phrase that everybody uses and genuinely believes it's a genuine concept in that respect. And they'll find it in so many places it never really existed previously. Or a similar concept might have existed previously that might have been the inspiration behind the spark of his work. But to say it's an absolute, he has drawn absolutely from this point, I think that's a step too far, really, because, you could analyse most things, couldn't you? I mean, I would say, how many times does that German piece use the word dreary, for example? I bet it doesn't. So, so it's sort of, I'm not the greatest defender of Poe, to be perfectly honest with you. I'm not going to sit here and defend it. As a creative process, I think that's really disingenuous to kind of put it that way.
You're saying that these suggestions are basically the Mandela effect, that people are sort of like seeing inspiration.
Well, the Mandela effect is misremembering, isn't it? The Mandela effect is the idea that you remember that something has happened that hasn't. Where this is, right. I think this is definitely looking for things. I think it's that kind of idea where you have an idea that this is what has happened, and you go looking for evidence of that, and you don't stop. I think the modern version of it is, I have a political point of view, and I'm going to search the internet until I find someone that agrees with me.
And yeah, absolutely. So, press the wrong button there. My thoughts. Did you want to hear my thoughts on where I think?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're here for.
I think he has decided to take a huge Gothic trope dump on the page and throw everything that he can that he thinks is a little bit spooky. And I've seen people suggesting that perhaps it's something to do with his relationship with his 13-year-old cousin wife.
Different times.
Yeah, different times. Yeah. Why isn't it like that? No, I didn't mean that.
Does that mean Jerry Lee Lewis was just plagiarizing Poe by marrying his cousin? You know.
Yeah. There are people that suggest that because he got this sickly 13-year-old cousin wife. I'm going to say 13-year-old cousin wife again because that just sounds like one of.
I love the phrase "a cousin wife." I think that's great.
Yeah, and there's parts of the town where we are at the moment where that's probably going to get picked up and used quite frequently and very accurately. But yeah, she was sickly, and throughout his life, there were a lot of sick women. Obviously, mother dying. The Mrs. Allen was very poorly. I can't remember whether she died whilst he was young or whether she was just sickly. But yeah, he'd got the Midas touch with women if, instead of turning them to gold, he made them dead sick. Yes, yeah, the Siddham touch, yeah. So, yeah, I think potentially that's part of it. But he just seems to be throwing everything that he possibly can. Oh, it's a big, spooky old house. Oh, the weather's very, very bad and dreary. And, yeah, cracks in the furniture. Oh, somebody's a little bit sickly. Oh, she's got catalepsy because she's a woman and women are all sickly. Oh, she's dead because women do that. And then, yeah, this whole, but she's not dead. And like you say, the synopsis makes it sound as though it's structured and it's a cohesive whole. But the whole story isn't that structured. The whole story does just come along as though if you get a 6-year-old, right, this isn't me suggesting experiments, by the way, but you get a 6-year-old, ask them to tell you a story, but first they've got to drink 6 cups of Sunny Delight. And then they start telling you, it's almost as though, and then this really miserable thing happened, and then this, and then, and halfway through a sentence, they're stopping themselves. And
so are you saying, Ash, that the editor of Poe has just taken out every time he's gone, and then this happened, and she burst through the door, that.
Yeah, the editor has sort of like gone through it and been so really fucking brilliant, we'll remove that, and the audience won't want. And then, Jesus Christ, which, given the fact that there is a strong relationship between Poe and rumours of substance abuse, in that case, potentially that might not be that far from the mark.
So in a way, we agree then that basically it's not so much a structured piece. It's kind of like he started at one point with a bit of an influence, and then started just writing. And I actually like your description of it there as a gothic dump on the page of just piling it up on top of itself until he just got to the point where it just broke when the house fell apart.
I was just looking. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now propose to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, although as boys we had been even intimate associates.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I really knew little of my friend. Oh, so glory holes.
Well,
Yeah.
type of people they used to hang around with, maybe. Or lithium.
Yeah.
Or lithium, one of the two.
Feeble gleams and crimson. I mean, his writing's gorgeous, isn't it? There's just so much wonderful description going on in here. But yeah, it is gloom after gloom after gloom. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians, a settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, slight cystitis, and frequent. It doesn't mention cystitis, really. I was joking there. I was adding that in for my own entertainment. And frequent, although transient, affections of a partially cataleptical character with the unusual diagnoses. And he's got the word hitherto after that. And yeah, you just anybody who can put hitherto in, yeah.
That turns it into classic literature.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
I was just reading this bit here. I was looking at some of the highlighted bits I put in. Unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the brutality of all attempts at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe. Brilliant.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I absolutely love his writing.
Yes, that is the kind of sentence that I think nowadays you would write that sentence and then you'd sort of like check yourself in the mirror, wouldn't you, and go, oh God, nobody's going to buy this now, because it's just so full of emotion all around it, you know.
But it's Poe's unity of impression, isn't it? He's sort of like going for this ideal of tying everything in so that it's got that whole thing. He was the one who suggested that to maintain that unity of impression, it needs to be something that can be read in a single sitting, which is, you don't sort of like think, oh, well, I've had a couple of pages of Usher, I'm going to go and, have my tea now. Once you start it, it's a couple of thousand words, and you go there right to the end, and he's got you all the way through, and you've got the emotional connection all the way through there as well.
It's a very good point, actually, because I think that's, from a creative point of view, that is part of the art of chapter writing as well, isn't it? You either write short stories or you write chapters like short stories. So the chapter itself can be read in one sitting, and it has an end to it that does make you want to read on, but you can stop at that point. It is the end of episode. And when you don't write like that, that's when books can become much harder to read. Like, I mean, going back to before they had chapters, with, was it Mole Flanders? And I've got to make sure I say that right, because I always think of The Simpsons every time that one comes up. And even actually, I'd go as far as saying Tolkien. I found with The Hobbit, his chapters were really like that. They were nice and concise and, to the point, and you could read them in one sitting. But when you get into the Lord of the Rings stuff, the chapters then start to spread out. There's a couple of nice short ones, but they do start to kind of spread out in such a way that it makes it hard to read a full chapter in one sitting. And therefore it becomes a real slog to get through, because you don't get to an end point. You don't get to a break. And I think that it interferes with your enjoyment sometimes.
But Tolkien, with Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit things, he wrote those for children that he despised, didn't he? And it was just a case of... I
thought the Hobbit he did, and he actually wrote that for his son, didn't he, whilst he was away. But the Hobbit, I like the Hobbit. I think the Hobbit's a great piece. But that's another discussion, I think. Doing
that is,
those ones, because I know you're not so keen on the Hobbit, but we have a very similar disliking for the Lord of the Rings as a piece of written work. But like we always say here, is actually this is not about just the written work. It's about the creativity behind it. And I think you can't knock the creativity behind what he does in that way. So that'll be an interesting one to do in that respect.
It will.
Yeah, because we'll have to try and keep in check on that one.
Well, I mean, I've been trying to read that damn book for several years now.
I didn't make it through it. Yeah, when the film came out, when Fellowship of the Ring was coming out, I'd been trying to read it because I'm a role player, as you know, and so fantasy worlds are something that are bread and butter to the role playing world. So it's a book I should have read, I should have read it by now, and I hadn't read it. So I finally got through it, and got to the end of it, and I much preferred the films. But it was
You're a
his
braver
writing.
man than I am.
It wasn't the ideas; it was his writing.
I've just not been it. I keep trying them and can't.
Yeah.
The idea's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of creepy little hobbit things, whatever they are. What are they meant to be?
Hobbits.
Yeah.
They're just little people, basically. They don't wear shoes. Big feet, though. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've seen that video.
Yeah. But yeah, they're kind of like the I suppose they represent the villagers, don't they? The old nature, because there's always been that kind of metaphor between the industrial age and the villages of the rural ideas, and so that's where a lot of the clashes are supposed to come in. But like I say, that's for another one.
That's for another one.
Yes, because we could easily just talk about that for hours.
Yes, that's the worrying thing, really. The fact that it would be such an interesting discussion, but it would mean reading Lord of the Rings.
No, it doesn't mean reading Lord of the Rings, and that's sometimes the point. Like I say, we're looking at the creativity behind things, and you can do that in small. I mean, reading Poe, and I'd say that to anyone, if anyone actually ever listens to this, and I don't know if they ever will, or whether they ever come back, I have no idea. But read some Edgar Allan Poe. Read Fall of the House of Usher, or get Christopher Lee to read it to you at bed one night, because it's great, and it really is a very interesting experience because of the haphazardness of it, because of the way that it just flows out. It is batshit crazy the way that it's put onto the page, and the kind of majesty and beauty in the words that he uses in such a depressing way. And it's a bit like, in music terms, I say it's like there's a band called Anthony and the Johnsons, where the beauty is actually in the despair of his voice. So you're listening to this guy's soul break on record, but it's beautiful to listen to because of it. And I think Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher is very much like that.
Musically, I would have compared it to Gustav Mahler, who, if you listen to, say, Symphony No. 5, has got so much beauty within it, but at the same time, there's a sense of despondency to it as well. But yeah, that's just me, and I don't want to come across as pretentious with Gustav Mahler, and not.
But this is the beauty. Okay, I like that. I like that as a thing. So I've compared it to Anthony and the Johnsons for the lowbrow. You've compared it to Gustav Mahler as the highbrow, and I can pronounce that because I do actually know who it is, even though I'm not academic. Okay, so if you're going to do that, so if you were going to say Fall of the House of Usher without watching a Poe movie starring Vincent Price, of which I personally suggest that you do, but can you think of a film or television show that has more recently been on that? Actually, I can think of one right now, actually, of a film that I would compare Fall of the House of Usher to in terms of tone.
Go on, what are you thinking?
I'm actually thinking the 1963 version of The Haunting, directed by Robert Wise.
Right.
I think it has that kind of, because it's mainly based on Ellie, from the Shirley Jackson book.
Yeah.
The Haunting of Hill House. And I know it was recently redone on Netflix, which was actually really good up until the last episode when it went really bad. But it has this phrase in it, which is, and those of us who walk there walk alone. So it starts off with, this is Hill House, it was haunted, it's a bit funny. And those that walk there walk alone, and then the paranormal investigators come in and investigate it. But there's this one character called Ellie, and she's a really sad character because she's homeless and lives with her sister, and her sister is really spiteful to her, but she's been invited to go to this house for the weekend, and she means to do it. It's all that kind of stuff. So her character is really melancholic, and she kind of falls in love with this house, or the house falls in love with her, and there's this whole kind of, you've seen things in her head, and you're hearing her thoughts all the way through it. until, you know, it has the ultimate thing. Spoilers, 1963. You've really had a chance to watch it already. When she dies at the end, and then she is the voice of the house, and she says, "And those of us that walk here walk alone." And that is the most important part of that, because it is that whole, there's 1,000 ghosts here, but none of them know each other. You are completely on your own within this house, and this house is it's inherently evil within the bricks itself. And I would say, as a film that captures that concept, and the fact that the paranormal investigators means that they are just throwing haunted house concepts at it all the way through, which I think makes it more frightening in that way. So I think that's a good film to watch for the general mood of Poe.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, from what you were saying there, I was thinking there's echoes of The Shining, the film, but that's got more malevolence behind it rather than melancholy.
Yes.
That's a building that sort of like really wants to fuck people over who've sort of like stayed there, whereas, where
the haunting is more, it's a house that just wants to kind of, you know, piss people off enough that they take their own lives, really. You know, that's what it does.
Brilliant.
Well, I think that was wonderfully fun. Do you have anything else that you want to add about Poe?
No, I think we might pop back to Poe at a future one, because he's written that many good things. I mean, things like, have you read The Black Cat?
No, but I do have it. I do have it.
We're going to have to dip into that one at some point, because, it's, you can't beat a bit of animal cruelty, can you?
And
also
different times.
The 1002nd Tale of Scheherazade is just a beautiful piece of writing that's so much fun. And the Purloined Letter, when he starts that off with the whole detective genre. So, there's an awful lot more we're going to be able to look into with Poe. But, I think... I think we've said an awful lot about him there.
And an awful lot about the creative process that could have been, I think, without going into trying to find evidence for our own ideas, you know, just basically generally going on about it. So I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that's our first podcast. We're going to figure out what we're going to talk about next time. We don't know what it is now, because, you know, we do these things on a whim. That's how it happens. But we're going to put this up. We're going to share it about the place, and please share it about the place for us. And if it's on YouTube, subscribe to whatever it is we put it up on. And if you have any ideas things you want us to discuss, give us comments, send us messages if you know where we are, and we will quite happily look at things and give them a discussion, but not as a self-promotion. We do like to promote new authors, and we probably will do that at some point, and new filmmakers and stuff like that. But don't do the whole, you know, don't reach up into the book and go, "Will you discuss Blood Ink by Colin Davis?" Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't look at the Tales of Inmouth, from Ashley Lister and say, "We're going to discuss this series." It's not about that. We're looking at, look at things that you've loved and said, "Let's have a look at the creative process on that one and see if we can come up with something."
Absolutely. And you've given me some ideas for what we could talk about in future ones. I was just thinking about a filmmaker I know who does some great stuff that I've seen on YouTube.
We need to promote these people as well. So that will be going on as well. So, but anyway, Ash.
So
thanks a lot, man. That was really cool. I like that. So we'll do this again at some point, and hopefully we'll be talking to you all later at a further point. So bye for now.